This is Wall Street Week. I'm David Westin. We're now joined by our Special Secretary Larry Summers of Harvard. So Larry, thank you so much for being with us. We got those jobs numbers at the end of the week on Friday. They were significantly better than expected, although there were some downward revisions for the prior month. At the same time, ISM numbers came in a little softer. What do you make of these jobs numbers, and particularly perhaps the wage numbers?
David, look, I think we're in the same kind of pattern we've been in for some time. As of right now, the economy looks pretty strong and inflation looks relatively under control. But there's a lot going on underneath the surface, and there are still substantial risks. I'm sticking with my three scenarios paradigm. Some risk of a downturn. We still keep not seeing it at all in the employment numbers. In the data on GDP, there's this big gap between total income and total output that makes things hard to read. And there's some worrying developments, some of the business surveys like that ISM, and in some of the credit data. So I think it's possible that the economy will go into recession in delayed response to monetary policy. That looks less likely to me than I might have thought some months ago. It's certainly increasingly possible that we'll have that much ballyhooed soft landing, as rare as those have been historically. And I think there's a risk that people are still underestimating, given the very worrisome fiscal prospect of the country, given the recent easing, quite substantial in financial conditions, given still tight, and the wage numbers, again, are not running right now. Today's number not running at a rate that's consistent with the 2% inflation target, given the uncertainties in geopolitics that could point to problems in supply chains. My gut is still that the market is underestimating the inflation risks in the current situation, and therefore probably overestimating the amount of Fed cutting that is going to take place. But it's a fairly close call, and the Fed is certainly doing the right thing by being entirely vigilant and signaling that it is very much going to be data dependent going forward right here. I do read the continued strength of the economy in the face of what's happened to rates as suggesting either that the neutral rate has risen substantially, or as suggesting that the economy is less sensitive to interest rates than we might have thought. Either one of those considerations would suggest a bit less urgency to rate cutting than many people suppose at the current moment. But look, I think the Fed is signaling determination with respect to inflation, is signaling a willingness to watch the data very closely, and I think that's, broadly speaking, where they should be.
Larry, we had a major development in something that you've talked about on this program more than once, and that is at Harvard, where you are a tenured professor, were president there, but more generally at college campuses, we saw the resignation of Claudine Gay from Harvard as president. I wonder what you make of it now that we're getting perhaps somewhat past the worst of the conflict. What are the larger lessons we should learn? What can be done in terms of reformation by the universities or otherwise?
David, I think this is a time of testing for universities, certainly unlike any other, certainly since the Vietnam War period, and perhaps even going beyond that. Some of our leading universities are under investigation, both from Republicans in the House of Representatives and from the Education Department of the Biden administration. Biden administration. You're seeing a degree of divisiveness on campus that I haven't seen since I first got to the Harvard campus in 1975. So I think there's going to be a very profound challenge of finding a vital center. Universities must stand up to some of the vitriolic forces on the populist right that seem to be in favor of everything up to book burning in support of enforcing some very particularistic vision on universities. At the same time, I don't think there's any question that they have been threatened from within by stifling orthodoxies that have led to the cancellation of speakers, that have led to people being discomforted by discussing issues like crime, like education, except in particular prescribed ways. And it's going to be a challenge of university leaders to find a way between those twin abhorrent poles. I have to say that this goes way beyond any individual. I think universities have, in many cases, including at Harvard, been failed by their trustees. At Harvard, we call the group the corporation. And in many ways, it is their job, above all, to maintain a healthy interface between the university and the broader society.
So, Larry, it's early going, but it looks at this point like it's entirely possible we'll have a choice between President Biden on the one hand, former President Trump on the other. Give us your sense from what we've seen so far about these two people and what they would embrace as economic policies, what difference it could mean for our economy.
David, I think this is probably the most consequential presidential election since the Second World War. I think you have a broad sense of what President Biden would support because you've observed what he has done. His has been a Keynesian approach to economic management. He has felt that one needs to put very substantial emphasis on market failures, particularly in areas relating to the environment and climate change. And in the long democratic tradition, he has worked to do things to support those who have been left behind. He has focused on supporting what he regards as particularly salient job-creating industries. I think there have been excesses on industrial policy, excesses on protectionism. There has been what I thought was a costly misjudgment in the extent of the initial fiscal stimulus. But broadly, President Biden has supported what I think is a sound activist approach to economic policy. President Trump showed us what he was made of during his 4 years in office, and even more clearly has showed us what his intentions are without the superstructure of restraint that surrounded him during his first term. He has indicated support for removal of all kinds of legal restraints on the power of the presidency. He has spoken of being dictator for a day. He has spoken of severing traditional alliances with the rest of the world, of undercutting long-standing American approaches to international trade, to economic regulation, to much else. I think all of this is very threatening to the American economy, in the same way that populism, while it sometimes yields temporary and initial economic benefits, it did for Mussolini, it did for Perón in Argentina, ultimately brings a great deal crashing down around it. And so I am very worried that we will be a very different country that cannot rely on the rule of law and take it for granted as we traditionally have if we experience a second Trump administration.
Larry, if we cast our minds back to November of 2016, there were a lot of concerns about President Trump when it became clear that he had been elected. And in fact, you remember the markets really went south very dramatically initially, but then they rebounded. And if you look basically on the track record of the Trump presidency, just from the point of view of investors as well as the economy, it is not a terrible record, I think it's fair to say. I mean, the markets did reasonably well. There was employment created. There was GDP growth. So is it possible that we might overreact to the possibility of a Trump 2.0?
You know, there's an old saying, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. That's going to be the way the rest of the world is going to see it. The rest of the world, which has had so much faith in the United States for all their resentments, and so many have been so reliant for so long, were prepared to see a first Trump term as an aberration. But after 91 indictments, after the events of January 6th, that is not how they will see a second term. That is not how they will ever see America again. That will represent a loss of the moral authority that the United States has had since it won the Cold War, since it won the Second World War. And that will, I think, make for a much less stable world. And so my plea to my friends in the business community is, I understand some of your concerns about overly progressive, overly government interventionist policies of the Biden administration. In many cases, I share some of those concerns. But that is a very different thing than undercutting the entire framework within which the United States and its business community have operated for all of our lifetimes. And that's a risk that I think we have an enormous stake in resisting. And I think history will judge very badly those who, for the sake of a more expedient, as they see it, corporate tax position, or a relaxation of what they see as overly burdensome regulation, go along with the subversion of American democracy. And that is what is at stake in this election. I would not be speaking in anything at all like this way if we were talking about an election involving Nikki Haley and an election involving Chris Christie. But I think the involvement of ex-President Trump takes all of this to an entirely different level of concern.
Okay, Larry, thank you very much for all those thoughts. As our special contributor here on Wall Street Week, he is Larry Summers of Harvard.